Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Today's episode cuts into the heart of one of humanity's oldest but brutal riddles. Why do we go to war? My guest today is Professor Richard Overy, one of the world's foremost historians of conflict. He's the author of landmark works on the Second World War, totalitarian regimes and military power. His latest book, Why War?, looks at the long history of organized conflict, why societies choose war, what patterns we can see across time, and whether peace is something that we can realistically expect. Thank you very much, Professor Overy, for your time on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've been writing about the subject for a number of years. What was that spark that led you to write Why War? Was it, what led you to that moment where now it's important for me to dig into the core reason why somebody might wage war, and you've gone to the evolutionary, from evolution to now?
Well, it's some years ago when I was writing a book about Britain between the wars. I discussed a bit the conversation between Albert Einstein and Sigmund Freud in 1932. The League of Nations invited Einstein to ask a question and to choose a person. He chose Freud and he asked the question, why war? And I was quite intrigued by that because Einstein thought that Freud would have the answer, that the answer to war lies in the mind. But of course, Freud was a bit depressing in his answer, said that human beings will always go on fighting, all animals do. And so I was intrigued by that. And when I had time, finally, a couple of years ago, I came back to that question and I thought, well, I've been studying the biggest war in history, the Second World War. I really ought to go back and ask some bigger questions about, why do human beings fight? And why have they apparently always fought, not just why have they fought over the last 2,000, 3,000 years. And so that's really, where I came from.
Right. For a moment, if you think about growing up, our parents always told us, don't fight. And then when you grow up and you watch people murder each other, kill in the name of land, or, for whatever reason that the politicians or the common man would have thought of. As a historian, do you find that ironic that while our upbringing is more sedate, and the whole idea is that, hey, you have to make sure you live in peace. But in reality, when we grow up, my five-year-old self, rather, will not be able to make sense of what happens when, I'm 42 now. So does that, as a historian, is that a dichotomy, or am I missing something very basic here?
Well, it is a paradox, I suppose, but much of that is true of the modern age. In fact, I think that, children brought up in the last 10,000 years, they would have seen violence going on around them. They would have regarded, the moment all the men went off to fight somewhere, they would regard as fairly normal. They would expect, in fact, as the boys, not the girls, of course, the boys, as they grew up, would also expect at some point they would become soldiers or braves or whatever. That habit has become dulled, of course, in the modern age, where we think of ourselves as more civilized, that we are able to collaborate and so on and so on. But, when the point comes, there are plenty of parts of the world today where men do indeed continue to fight and see it as justified and something that they should be doing.
And from the evolutionary standpoint, where did your research lead to? While Freud said that everybody, that's human beings are much like animals and it's part of biology perhaps, but what did your research lead you to discover? That where did we all start fighting in the first place?
Yes, well, most people don't accept Freud's argument anymore, but evolutionary biologists and evolutionary psychologists do go back a long way, and they argue that if you look at the archaeological record, if you look at the pattern of more modern tribal societies and so on, or hunter-gatherers and so on, it's very difficult to accept the argument that people didn't fight at all for the first 200,000 years of Homo sapiens, and only began to fight a few thousand years ago. I think it's almost certain that not proper war as we understand it, but warfare, fighting, collective fighting, intended to have a lethal outcome, is something I think which goes way back in the human lineage. And it goes way back because human beings were very vulnerable creatures. Vulnerable to bigger animals, vulnerable to other humans. Their key was to find ways of protecting themselves, and if that actually meant in the end defending yourself by fighting, or fighting other people because you were frightened what they were going to do, I think that's something which must be characteristic of the way human communities developed over the last say, 1,000 years. The archaeological record is very difficult to reconstruct because most stuff's disappeared. But we go back at least 20,000 years to find signs of collective violence.
You also write about, was it a Neanderthal man, where you show that 55% of injuries that you saw or archaeologists saw was to the head, neck and shoulder, which cannot
Yes.
have happened unless somebody is wanting to club the other person.
Yes. Well, some people argue that that was because they were trying to fight very difficult big animals, but I don't really accept that. I mean, the largest quantity of Neanderthal bones or remains that we have in a cave do show extensive evidence of what can only be human damage, either other Neanderthals or more likely, I think, Homo sapiens. Neanderthal man died out, as we know, 40,000 years ago. And I think the Homo sapiens probably played quite an important part in achieving that.
Did you also reckon that before nations had leaders like Napoleons and Alexanders of the world, people would live in small groups, hunter-gatherers or later agriculture, and they would not go beyond a few kilometers. That was their life because there was no mode of transport, say, or it was too tedious. Did it all start where a village will start plundering the other to get a bit of, their chickens? Or is that anything to do with, how villagers who one day were looking eye to each other and something happened and, something goes wrong in the head, somebody takes a call. How does that collective behavior happen during a time when there were no leaders? It's like the whole village, say.
No, indeed. No, I mean, commonly in modern tribal societies too, when there is fighting, all the men fight. They may fight following, one of the strong warriors in the village. They may admire one of the, stronger warriors, and he becomes the organizer of the conflict. Now, they don't fight all the time. Of course, it's possible to collaborate. Of course, in fact, two villages that collaborate side by side can actually end up fighting each other. Of course, when something goes wrong. And a lot of things can go wrong. One village can accuse another village of practicing magic. Somebody dies in the village, and they say, well, that was because somebody, put a curse on them from the village next door. Or they might say, well, we're running out of animals to hunt. Maybe we should move on a bit and take the land from the people next door. Or maybe you just need more land. If you've got a bigger, more fertile, more effective population, well, maybe it's time to expand that population at the expense of other people.
And when you contrast that with, let's say, modern times, whatever the definition of modern might be, where these days it's the state that has the monopoly on violence, as I think it was Max Weber who once put it. Is that a difference where wars are typically very formal, they're declared by governments and also regulated by laws like the Geneva Convention, for example? Do you see that shift over the years? And is it a good thing or a bad thing where the states have that authority, if at all they do, and they are the only ones who do?
Yes, I mean, it has been a big shift, of course. But, the modern state system is very recent. If we're talking about the last 6,000 years, there were empires, almost all the empires, whether it's, Babylon, Assyria, Sumeria, Rome, Greece, were warlike empires. They fought at the expense of others. They burned whole cities down, slaughtered whole urban populations. And they often did so because, the leaders, the priests, the warriors colluded together. They wanted to build an empire. They wanted to extend that imperial power. In many cases, of course, they weren't really states at all. Much of the fighting in, for example, North America or in much of Europe up until the Middle Ages was carried out by quite small groups where they'd be led by maybe a warrior elite of some kind or other. But they were not states in any of our modern sense. The real damage that states have done from perhaps 16th, 17th century onwards is that they have come to represent the whole community, and their leaders have waged war in order to achieve a number of things, whether it's, religious conflict or whether it's for more land or empire and so on and so on. But even then, I think it's not just leaders and not just states. You have to have a population that is willing, when asked, to engage in war.
Which means that popular opinion is what the politicians or the leaders in power will try to, they'll try and sway the masses to lead them to believe that there is a reason for us to go to war and please back us. Is that the way it works today then?
Well, they might today, although in fact quite often it can be the other way around. It can be the people pressing the government. Let's think about the British public that became more and more incensed about Hitler and wanting, in the end to stop Hitler. The government, had to respond to that pressure. Or, we can look at the case of the First World War. Their populations became very enthusiastic about defending the nation, about, issues of honour and so on. The public flocked to volunteer to fight in 1914. They didn't know what they were going to get, of course. Nobody would looking at 1914 would say it was just the leaders who said, let's do this. There was popular nationalism, popular enthusiasm that war would somehow solve the issue.
That's interesting because the converse is also true, isn't it? It was the pressure from the Americans that got the government to pull the plug on Afghanistan overnight, pretty much, right? Where they said that, let's stop sending our soldiers there. And for whatever, whether right or wrong, I'm not getting into it, the decision was then taken. So the converse can also be true then?
No, it can, yeah. Look at Vietnam too. Yeah. But I think what we need to be sure of, because I've often been told by people, oh, it's just leaders, isn't it? If it weren't for leaders, none of this would happen. But it's not just leaders. There are soldiers, there is a military establishment, there is public opinion and so on. So it's, even in the modern age, it's a more complicated thing. 5,000 years ago, it wasn't so complicated. 5,000 years ago, the local ruler, his warrior elite and so on, and the priests who were always recruited, of course, to support the idea of war, would, they'd get together, think about, was it worth fighting the people next door? The people next door insulted them. Well, let's go off and we'll conquer them, and they'll be part of our empire. There's a lot to be said for the idea that warfare is a collective effort. You couldn't do it. You just couldn't do it, if it were not a collective effort.
And it has changed over time. I remember in India, we have grown up to reading British history, or rather the struggle for independence from the British Empire. For pretty much the entire schooling that we have in history is around that. Now, it all started with the East India Company. If you could help me understand that bit. I don't think we questioned our teachers back then that it wasn't the government, but it was an enterprise which started the whole thing. And how did that run? Because that was an empire. And was that any different? It wasn't war as much as invasion, where it was, colonization rather, and India was among many countries. So it was a corporatized affair. So it was a corporate running the whole thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, warfare can be launched by, any number of institutions or organizations and so on. And in fact, much of the war that has, occupied the last 500 years in Europe and elsewhere, of course, has been civil war. In fact, it's not about the state, really. It might be against the state, but it's, two different peoples in the same nation, the same state, decide to fight each other for religious purposes or ideological division or whatever it is. But civil war, of course, is also characteristic, and that's not about states. It's about a different kind of entity. So I think that when we're talking about warfare over a long period of time, we're not just talking about leaders and states. We're talking about a much more complicated historical process.
So in that particular case, with the East India Company, did it just start as a trading of spices in the east of India, and then they took over? So was there a difference back then?
Well, I mean, the government clearly had close relations with the East India Company, and East India Company, occasionally depended on assistance, of course, from the British state. But until the East India Company had to give up its position in India, it was more or less autonomous. The same was true of the trading company in South Africa too, in Cecil Rhodes. Eventually, in both cases, in order to preserve the empire, the government came to intervene and to play a much larger role. But it was certainly possible for a trading company based on aggressive commerce to take the lead.
Right. And war as a result of, let's say, economics or ideology. Do you see that, they could be a result of not just individual decisions by very powerful men, but it could also be structural forces like economics causing somebody to take that call to wage a war or to invade a neighboring country? Do you see those forces also at play, or they are pretty much all the time at play?
Well, they are, though, in fact, I mean, this is a broadly a Marxist view that somehow or other modern capitalism is imperialistic and warlike. I think that most people don't accept that. They certainly accept that capitalism is a power in the world, and it's a ruthless power in the world.
Hmm.
But for many capitalists, of course, a state of peace is better than a state of war, which can
Yes.
often be extremely damaging to capitalist interests. And the idea that capitalists put pressure on governments to make war is something extremely difficult to demonstrate.
Hmm.
Now, what you can demonstrate, of course, is that a state being led, for example, by Hitler and the Nazi Party, might well decide that Germany's economic future depends on extending our land and seizing resources, other people's resources. Now, it wasn't German business that did that. It was Hitler and the Nazi Party, with the collusion of the military and with the collusion, of course, of the economic leadership. But the idea that, in the modern age, that what you need is to seize other people's resources and to colonize more land was something driven, in this case, by Hitler and the Nazi Party, and not by big business. And you'll find, I think, quite a number of other examples where the current view is that, it must have been business that did that. But in fact, when you examine it much more closely, business has a much more cautious attitude to these issues. It's quite often driven by nationalism, strategic interests, and so on, or sheer greed, a
Sure, agreed.
desire simply to take other people's resources.
Yeah, and you also write in your book about how you talked about Hitler right now. Similarly, the autocratic leaders to brainwash people, their use of language that also plays a very important role. You write about Rwandan genocide where victims were called cockroaches, so that people will not have any sympathy. They are not looking at a fellow human being, but a cockroach, which when you read is ludicrous, but if you drill it enough, people might suddenly start detaching themselves from that group by literally thinking that they are not fit to be living on earth. So language is something that leaders have used then.
Yeah, well, not just leaders, of course. I mean, social psychologists emphasize this a lot, that when you're trying to explain how people can make war and sustain brutal war, how they can fight war like the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, or the Rwandan genocide, or indeed the German genocide of the Jews, that much of that violence really does depend on creating a dehumanized image of the enemy. And once you do that, it becomes much easier, not for the leaders, but it becomes much easier for the rank and file, the people who are doing the killing.
Right.
Much easier for them to do the killing, and they often do it really without any empathy for the people. They do see them as the other, something outside, so that they don't deserve the same kind of rights or sympathy that you do. It makes it possible to kill people in large numbers and in brutal ways. And that's been true not just in the modern age, 20th century. Actually, it's been true all the way through human history. I mean, if you go back to the Romans, it's possible to see that they cast the enemy as the other, and you can then do to the other things that you would never dream of doing to your own people. Like in the Roman case, you could destroy a town, kill all the men, and take all the women and children into slavery. I mean, you could only do that if your view of the other was that these people don't deserve what we as Romans deserve.
And have things, in terms of Geneva Convention, or there are rules which say that you can't starve people to death. There are some rules even in engagement. Do you see that they are indeed being followed? We've got on one hand Russia and Ukraine, on the other Israel, Palestine. It's all Palestine rather. Very complicated affairs on both sides. And then you have news of how I think the other day, 10 children from the same family were murdered.
Nine
With the
children.
9 children, correct, in Gaza. And you hear that somebody who's sitting all the way here in Mumbai, and you wonder what's happening. So are these casualties collateral damage? Are there even rules that are followed?
Well, I mean, they've tried. I mean, for most of human history, for most of the warfare I'm talking about in my book, there were no rules. There were some rough rules in the Middle Ages where the knights had to follow at least some kind of chivalrous code of conduct that they often didn't. But, the invention of rules and rule-based warfare really is a product of the 19th century, late 19th century in particular. It particularly followed actually the American Civil War, which was a particularly savage war, and a great effort was made to impose some kind of battlefield rules after that. Then the rules became solidified in the 20th century, but in many cases, states don't ratify the rules. In other words, they might sign something and so on. You get back home, they decide not to ratify it. And the rules have proved to be extremely ineffective. In the First World War, if you take the First War, for example, which was a more rule-based conflict than more recent conflicts. Even then, when it became necessary to violate those rules, they were violated. The Second World War, they were violated routinely, particularly by the Axis states. But the attempt to impose rules again, 1949 Geneva Convention, the 1977 Geneva Protocols and so on, has proved extremely ineffective. The thing people wanted to do was to stop civilians being bombed.
Right.
Because that was the most common way for civilians to be killed in large numbers and their houses burnt down. And, that was the idea in 1977 of the protocols. And it's been repeated in the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court and so on. And yet, look at Ukraine and look at Gaza. These are rules you can just tear up and throw away if they don't suit you. So the imposition of rules of war is very patchy. If it's expedient to ignore them, people ignore them. The depressing thing about that is that, we should, in the 21st century, if we do, have to use military force, we should be using it and pay close attention to those rules and make sure the rules are not violated. And in some cases, that happens. But sadly, in most of the conflicts we've seen in the 21st century, it's not been the case.
And there are also cases about, like I read a few years ago about this concept called gunboat diplomacy, where you have a big, you'll have to help me out here, an intimidating ship with a lot of arsenal on it, going close to another country just to tell them that, hey, we are watching you, don't mess with us. And then they'll go back after a few days. So nobody's hurt, but it's a little bit of a threat. It's like an older parent telling the older, or rather the parent telling the older sibling to take care of the younger one, otherwise you're going to have it from me. So I'm watching you. Is that how it is? Is that sometimes, can that be effective means of war?
Well, I mean, it's a 19th century concept. The British were supposed to be the ones who practiced gunboat diplomacy, so that when they had a problem with China, they would send a couple of big ships off the Chinese coast. They might even bombard it if necessary and so on. But gunboat diplomacy, I think, although most historians argue it's something from the past, quite clearly it still exists. America sends a couple of battleships and an aircraft carrier or two to the Persian Gulf. It's not there on a holiday. It's there to threaten Iran or whoever it is, they regard as their current enemy. So in a sense, the capacity of major naval powers still to do that exists. But most military force today is land-based and air-based, particularly air-based. And that's, I think, where most strategic thinkers concentrate their writing.
And your research over the years, are there any historical moments where a major war was narrowly averted? And perhaps they have some lessons that we can learn from. Is there something that, because when a war, when it doesn't make it in the news, it's because nothing happened there. But there were many things that happened that prevented the big war from happening.
Yes.
Are there any such instances?
Well, in fact, your country is a good example, I think. India's relationship with China, which has not been an easy one, and its relationship with Pakistan, which even today is not an easy one at all. And yet, over that 50 or 60-year period, India has managed to avoid committing itself to major war, as indeed has Pakistan. And there are all kinds of constraints that operate. In fact, I think that's quite a good example, in fact, in the modern age, of a potential conflict which hasn't really become a big conflict, alongside all kinds of other conflicts in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, and now in Europe, which, where the person who's led the conflict or is committed to conflict thinks that war is a solution and not the problem. I think in India, certainly, I imagine, and the view is that war is always a problem. It's risky. All kinds of things can go badly wrong. So you might make a big fuss, you might have a skirmish or two and so on, but you don't actually engage in big war. And I hope that remains the case between India and Pakistan.
Right. It happened recently as well, didn't it? Things escalated after the terrorist attack in Kashmir, and there was a retaliation from India, but I think that the whole idea was people got onto the table and it was de-escalated in reasonably quick time. Which, do you see that as an exception then, as a historian, that it's something that everyone can learn from? Is that what might be?
Well, I mean, I hope so. I mean, I hope that people do learn, that it's much better to de-escalate. You can make a big fuss. You can use a lot of warlike rhetoric and so on. You can perhaps have the odd little, mini battle or two. But actually, it is better in the end to think about ways of de-escalating, to think about ways of reaching, well, if not compromise, but at least to be able to collaborate reasonably together. And as I said, I hope that remains the case with India and Pakistan. But there are plenty of examples, of course, where people should not really have gone to war. They go to war on a pretext, or they go to war, or, from a misperception. We come back to the First World War, which is, the big war of the 20th century, which gave rise to the Second World War. And there is a good case where, if they'd actually been able to sit down properly together, or they'd been able to say to themselves, well, we're worried about country X, but actually we shouldn't really be worried. We should try and find a way of cooperating. It might have been possible to avoid that bloodbath. And then, of course, European and world history might well have been very different. But time and again, it doesn't happen. Time and again, people reach the tip-over point and they tip over. Putin in Ukraine is a good example. He could have found other ways of coping with the problem in Ukraine and coping with Russian security, but he chose war instead.
So is that any different in dictatorships then, where there's a book by Marcel Dersis, he's written a book called How Tyrants Fall, and he's written about how dictators are worried about internal coups very often, and when they go to war, I mean, I would imagine they're at a point of no return. Now they have to double down their efforts, even if the economy is failing, even if there are sanctions against them. What's the deal with Putin, for instance, in this case?
Well, he's a classic example. I mean, he has his own motives, which are geopolitical motives, but he also knows that he's got to win over the Russian people, and he's got to keep telling them that he's winning. And, he is, of course, worried that somehow or other, if he fails in war, somehow, that might mean his political demise. Look at Pinochet sorry, not Pinochet, Galtieri in Argentina, when he lost the Falklands War, which was waged partly to take away attention from all the economic problems in Argentina and so on and so on. He lost the war and he lost his political power. So yes, it does play, an important part. It, played an important part 1,000 years ago too. Where some local prince would think to himself, I've got to show my people and my soldiers that I'm tough. So we'll go to war, and you lose the war. What happens? The prince loses his political power. So this too has a very long history.
And with the advent of drones, artificial intelligence, I mean, not too long ago, I remember watching this movie Black Hawk Down, which was my only reference point to the Somali, the rescue mission of a few American soldiers there, where it was the footage was grainy in the control room. The guys who had to take that call had to rely on messengers on the road, on walkie-talkie, and that was only a couple of decades ago, or 3 decades ago. Today, things have changed where you can actually aim something the size of a pin in a house where a guy is walking on the terrace and it'll hit him in the ear if you want that to happen. So we live in a different world. How much has warfare changed, and what are the wider consequences of technology coming in the way it has?
Well, I mean, the assumption is that, of course, the threshold of military research has been pushed forward, for 10,000 years, from flint axes to thermonuclear bombs. So, it constantly moves forward. But now we're living in an age where everybody says things are going to be different. Say drones, artificial intelligence and so on, the electronic battlefield. But the striking thing, I think, about war in Ukraine and in Israel is that much of the war has been conducted in a way that's perfectly recognizable to us, with tanks, with fighter bombers. In the end, with infantry on the ground, with artillery and machine guns and so on. Indeed, much of this Russian effort in Ukraine is based on a range of weaponry which will be familiar in the Second World War. So I think we should not exaggerate the extent to which drones and electronic technology will change things. The more worrying thing, I think, is that if you think you can wage electronic and drone warfare, including cyber war and so on, and you could get away with not losing too many of your own people. So you might just decide, let's try and fight this high-tech war and see what happens. And I don't think that much would happen, in fact. High-tech will get you so far, but it won't actually get you to occupy land or to destroy the terrorist organization you're trying to destroy. Look at Israel. It spent 18 months trying to destroy Hamas. Hamas is still there, but not all of Hamas. A lot of Hamas has been killed and so on. The idea that somehow or other you can root them out that way has not worked. And so you've got Gaza full of Israeli tanks. And I think, as I said, we shouldn't exaggerate the nature of the progress. If it's a war about territory or about control of territory, as in Ukraine, in the end, territory has to be controlled in old-fashioned ways, by infantry, by tanks, by artillery, and conventional air power. And I think those all still have a role to play.
And do you believe that we are entering into this? You give the example of Ukraine, and we talked about Hamas and Israel right now. Are we entering into a more war-prone area or period yet again, or is that alarmist thinking? You think like there's too much happening around? There are talks of a youngster might come up to and ask you, are
Yes,
we at the cusp of a third world war? As somebody
yes.
who's an expert, how would you respond to that?
Well, I'm often asked this question, obviously.
Yeah.
I think it is exaggerated. I think the problem is that Ukraine has prompted military and political leaders in the West, particularly, to talk up war all the time. We need more armaments and so on. Will Russia invade us and so on? I mean, much of this is fantasy. Russia has no intention of invading the rest of Europe, and indeed would suffer severely if it did so. And there's all the talk of Trump, let's take over Greenland and Canada and so on and so on. And much of this is, I think, rhetoric, irresponsible rhetoric, I think.
Right.
It'd be much
Okay.
better to talk up peace. Still got ways of, finding collaboration, to put more and more pressure on those countries that are engaged in war at the moment, to think twice. More will be gained, perhaps, in the end for your people by sitting at a conference table than will be gained by putting more and more of your men through the battlefield ordeal.
Right.
So, yes, I don't think we are about to enter the Third World War, and all the talk of nuclear war is exaggerated. But that doesn't mean, of course, that we're not living in a more unstable age. We clearly are. Putin hoping to push Russia back to great power status. China's geopolitical position a little uncertain and so on. America in the hand now of a populist president. Yeah, we are living in a age which is more unstable than was the case 20 years ago.
But at the same time, we are nowhere close to catastrophic Armageddon kind of a situation.
No, I don't think so. No, no. No, I mean, it's not like the 1930s, not like before 1914. There are many people, keep saying the analogy is very strong. It's just like the 1930s, and it's not. There's no Hitler massively rearming somewhere who's going to destabilize the world. There are areas of instability. Much of it the responsibility of particular leaders, but I think that for the rest of us, we're not going to be plunged suddenly into a global world of violence.
So there will be some sanity, you think, that will prevail in whoever takes that call. I remember talking to one of the editors at The Economist, and he once told me that Nixon, when he would announce something, that he wants to do something to his aides, they would not take the step there and then, hoping that he will forget a week down the line to follow up. I mean, they would also do that because they knew that may not have been the best way to go with. So there will be
Yeah,
a little
well,
bit of.
Nixon's a good example, actually, of a statesman who, despite the fact that he was in charge of the most powerful country in the world, did step back, did make relations with China more normal, did in the end decide that the Vietnam War wasn't worth fighting and so on. So he will eventually seem actually quite a good example, I think, in the 20th century, even though he's extremely unpopular with a great many people. But yeah, we're not, I think, facing Armageddon. We do need some sensible heads around who calm things down and argue that what we need to do is to be able to establish more secure framework for cooperation. And there are a great many states whose interest is to do exactly that. So let's talk about less war and let's talk about more collaboration. I can't really say that, having written a book all about war. I don't think that, having said that, I don't think war is going to die out. My conclusion is, I think, fairly pessimistic. Thousands and thousands of years of human collective violence. I don't think we're going to put that to one side overnight. But on the other hand, I don't think we're going to move to a global catastrophe.
And when you wrote this book, Professor Overy, what's your writing method? There are more than 100 pages of merely notes and footnotes and the references to books. So there's a lot of reading involved. You've spent your
Yes.
life on the subject, obviously. How do you go about telling the audience what they need to know, but only as much as they can chew and digest?
Yes.
How do you go about that decision and the writing process?
Well, it's a long practice, in fact, in my case. Well, you just, it is practice. You, as an
Ah,
historian, you get in the habit of, of embracing all the material you think is useful, and rejecting the stuff you don't think is very useful. You read it, you synthesize it, you think about how you're going to structure your arguments and so on, what works, what doesn't work. And that's the most complicated part of all, the planning stage. As I would say to any student, the critical thing when you're writing an essay, particularly a history essay, is the planning. And once you've got the plan, pretty much stick to it. And that's what I do. I have the paper here, the planning stuff here, and I sit at the computer and write it.
and when did you decide that you wanted to be a historian many years ago?
Yeah, well, people ask me if there was a moment. I don't think there's a
Yeah.
single moment. I mean, I've been very interested in history as a young child. I'd spent a lot of time reading history books on my own, and it was the thing that fascinated me most at school. And so it was a slow process, I think. I mean, the critical thing is knowing whether you are going to be good enough to be an historian. And I didn't know that. I went to Cambridge, and I was a very modest student, I thought, and rather anxious student. So I didn't know until I got a very, very good degree result and the things I wrote seemed okay, that I would actually have the capacity to be an historian. And so I went on from that. But to be an historian really is it's a growth. There's a growth period. You've really got to grow into being an historian. You can't be a successful historian overnight. It's a slow process, and it does require good deal of commitment, a lot of hard work, of course, as do most disciplines and so on. But most of all, it requires imagination. You've always got to be able to put yourself back into the position of the people that you're writing about. So even though I'm writing about hunter-gatherers 20,000 years ago, I had to think about, what it is that will motivate hunter-gatherers and so on. Why is it that they will engage in violence? Just as much as I have to put myself in the position of Putin and say to myself, why is he waging war?
Because it's a big responsibility, isn't it? When I, as a reader, read about war by someone like you, I just have to, I believe it all because it comes from a historian who spent his life so what kind of, does it exasperate you as well, that common phrase that history is written by the winners, or I forget,
Yeah.
history is not written by the vanquished, so it is very
Yeah.
one-sided, and then you are a historian, you have to make sure that you're telling a story which is
Yeah.
true, and and you also need to read through the bullshit, forgive me, which may have been written where you are actually trying to tell the truth. How difficult is it, and is that a fair argument when people say no, history is it's about from which point of view you are looking at?
Yeah, well, I mean, people do say that, but in fact, to be a good historian is you have to put yourself in the position of the people you're writing about, and you have to not pass moral judgments all the time. People will pass moral judgments when they read what you write, and that's fine. But what you do is explain why things happen. That's what I'm trying to do with Why War. I'm not passing moral judgments. I'm not saying how terrible war is, although I'm not a militarist or a warmonger. But I do want to explore explanations for it. So that, the more we can explore explanations which seem plausible, the closer we will come to understanding why it happens. So that's really what I as an historian want to do all the time. You take a big question and try and find an answer.
Students who learn from you, over the years, have their quality improved or remained the same? Do you find different kinds of students coming in? Has the quantity reduced because there are other disciplines that people are gravitating towards? Because one school of thought is, hey, why are you reading history? That is not going to make you money, is what some parent might tell a kid. Don't do this, do something like computer science,
Yes,
which will get it.
indeed, yeah.
So how do you respond to that?
Well, history is still very popular worldwide, but of course it does compete with a whole lot of other disciplines which were not around 60 years ago. Now we have a whole world of different studies, and students can gravitate to those. But history students, there's still a great deal of commitment to history as a subject. Well, over the years that I taught, the quality of students did not, as often suggested, decline. In fact, in many cases, because we had to teach in a more and more professional way all the time, actually the students tended to achieve more rather than less. And I hope that will continue to be the case.
Professor Overy, thank you so much for your time on the podcast, and many congratulations yet again for
Thank you.
Why War, and requesting all listeners to pick this one up. Thank you again,
I
Professor.
can tell you, by the way, that it's going to be out in paperback in a few days' time.
Lovely.
So if they want to get the paperback instead of the hardback, it'll be available.
Lovely. Thank you so much for the heads up, Professor.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.